It's a pleasure for me to speak to this Dutch audience. I have been coming to the Netherlands to discuss care ethics since 1991. So it is really the first place in the world where my ideas were taken seriously. And frankly, I include my home country in that. So I'm very delighted that you will be thinking more seriously about care ethics there. I have written about care ethics since the 1980s. I've published several books, Moral Boundaries, Caring Democracy. And today what I thought I would do is talk about care ethics and children's rights as a way to make the case for why we should take the rights of children seriously, of course, but why we should use a care ethics perspective to think about all of the kinds of topics that social workers study. In her book in 2020, Wendy Luttrell, a colleague of mine actually at City University, writes about a group of working class kids in Massachusetts where she was going to go study the school for a while. And the 10-year-olds took her around the school to introduce her to the lay of the land. And they began by telling her things like this. This is my favorite example. This is where the kindergarten, the 5-year-old children, have their classroom. You'll notice it's the closest classroom to the cafeteria. And that's because you don't want the little children to be running all around the building and be afraid and maybe get lost. You want to be able to make sure they're going to be safe. Children's worlds are filled with care. They understand instinctively the importance of care as a way to think about the world. So what is it about us as adults that we have lost the sense that care is the central category by which we can make a way to understand our entire world? So what I want to do today is to make an argument about why care ethics really could be the basis for our way of making analyses of the rights of children, and for that matter, all matters in social work, and for that matter, all matters everywhere. But that's a different topic for another day. So let's talk first about care ethics. I'll give you some of the basic elements of care ethics. Then I want to compare care ethics to a justice ethics or rights approach. And then I'll talk about children's rights and care ethics by looking closely at the UN principles for children's rights and seeing how we might make a more careful and better set of judgments if we use care ethics as our framework. So let's start by defining care. Now, in 1990, Berenice Fisher and I published this definition of care. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave into a complex, life-sustaining web. Now, this definition is very broad, and frankly, philosophers hate it. They hate it because it is so broad and because it encompasses seemingly everything. But to us, that was part of the point. Care is everywhere, and it includes almost everything. But let me say a few things more about the definition. It includes everything we do on the most general level, but obviously at more specific levels, there are, if you'll let me use this language, nested care activities. So phlebotomy is a care practice. It has a more limited purpose than medical diagnosis, but it contributes to medical diagnosis. And the way we know that phlebotomists are doing their jobs well is because they enhance that next level of judgment. And so too, in specific practices, we engage in a specific practice for the purpose of the next higher practice of care and ultimately to live in the world as well as possible. So this definition is deliberately broad, but it's not only about dependency. This is something that people often misunderstand about care, thinking it's about dependency. Instead, it describes conditions of interdependency of caregivers and care receivers, all of whom matter in making the process of care whole. Here we have the Dutch slide.
Yes,
of
we can
care
read it.
ethics. You can read it. I can't. I won't even try to pronounce it. But Berenice Fisher and I originally came up with 4 phases of care. First is caring about, which means that you begin by recognizing there's a need to care in the first place. It's about needs, and it's about the moral value, I argue, of attentiveness. Secondly, once you've noticed there's a problem, you then have to take care of the problem. The baby needs changing. Who's going to do it, right? There has to be someone who steps up and takes responsibility. Now, taking responsibility is not the same thing as doing it, right? You could say, oh, it must be time to feed the baby. Call home and say to the person there, please feed the baby, it's time. That's taking responsibility. And it obviously requires that responsibility be a moral element of care. Third, care requires caregiving. That is the actual work, changing the baby, feeding the baby, thinking about whether or not this person has an appropriate place to live and making sure there is an appropriate place to live, cleaning the house. All of those activities are the work of care. And they also require a moral quality of competence. Now, especially as professionals, we often think of competence as a technical skill, not a moral one. But to try to do a job without being competent in it is a kind of moral failing as well as a technical failing. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and notice it. Fourthly, we react to the care, which is care receiving, and has the moral quality of responsiveness. Now, the responsiveness is partly on the part of those who have done the care work, but it's also those who have noticed the problem, those who have taken responsibility, and for that matter, those who have received the care. Because all of those elements are part of whether or not we make the judgment, this care has gone well or gone badly. Finally, caring with requires us to recognize that care exists over time. I added this dimension after I started to think more systematically about care in society, and especially in democratic society. Because once we can be sure that the care we've received will continue, we are in a different location than if we are frightened that, say, tomorrow there won't be any food or a place to live. And it brings with it the social values of trust and solidarity. Trust in institutions and to others who we make as our agents to help us take care, and solidarity in feeling with others who are similarly located with us, that we're in this together. And when those 2 values are fully realized, then we are living in a democratic society in which caring is actually functioning.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
Is it possible to deliver care without trust?
It is possible to deliver care without trust, but it's not going to be very good care.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean, if the people receiving the care don't expect it to be good, don't expect you to be trustworthy, then the reaction is going to be very different. One of the things that can build trust is repeatedly making certain that the care is actually meeting the needs of the people who need it. And in fact, I would say that's one of the most important ways to build trust. Well, go on. Over the years, I've been working on this topic now for many, many years. So I thought I would share with you some lessons I think I've learned about it. The first lesson, and this is an abstract one that you can think about, comes from Harry Frankfurt's wonderful phrase in an essay he published in 1982 originally, and then in 1988. The importance of what we care about. That is, as Frankfurt was a moral philosopher, he looked around and said, yes, we know we should do our duties, and we know we should try to benefit most people in utilitarianism, but that doesn't really capture what our moral life is about. What our moral life is really about is the importance of what we care about. I would argue to you that in contemporary societies, especially in higher income countries in the world, but everywhere, what we care about the most is what I call wealth care. That is, we care about wealth being able to sustain itself and create new wealth. And I published a little essay last year about this subject. But the point is simply that insofar as everything gets monetized in our world today, everything gets turned into a financial advantage or disadvantage, we've really distorted and lost the capacity to think about care in a meaningful way. Now, I'm not saying wealth is a bad thing, but I am saying that if we focus solely on caring for wealth, then we're going to lose important elements of society. What do I mean by caring for wealth? I mean that money makes money. It's not even any longer about doing a job to produce a good, because it doesn't matter if the good is especially nice or not. What matters is whether or not it makes money for the people who have turned up the money to make the good. And this endless focus on whether or not something is profitable, whether or not you're getting a return on your investment, which begins even to infiltrate through new public management into the way we organize public policy, this means that we have turned all of our attention to economic matters when in fact the economy should be serving us. But relationships matter more, or should matter more, than things, than resources, than power, than money, than places, than any of the resources we normally think of when we start to think about justice and distributing those resources. Now, that means that we have to put our way of making and maintaining relationships central. And you'll notice, again, from the standpoint of wealth care, relationships don't produce wealth, so they're not necessarily that valuable. Well, they do, but it's a complicated relationship. So we have to be aware of thinking about care only as a dyadic relationship. This is the second point. So often when we think about care, we start to think, we try to simplify it. And so the simplest relationship, of course, is between two people, a caregiver and a care receiver. But really, come on, that's never the situation. There's always more people involved. Often there are two parents, their siblings, their aunts and uncles, their teachers, their doctors, their kids in the community. There's the lady down the street who's nice to you. All of those people matter in, say, children's lives. And if we only focus on the relationship of, say, the parent to the child, we're going to miss something else really important about what's going on in that life. So we have to make sure that we're thinking in a complex way about the relationships of care. So the ultimate goal of care is to have an integral approach, and attend to the health of the relationship is a way to try to do that. But last point here about relationships, they are complex, and the roles of caregiver and care receiver coexist, and they often change. One of the most important things I'll talk about today is that children recognize themselves as caregivers as well as care receivers. And if we don't do that too, when we think about what children need, we're missing something important about their lives.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, why you can add pets, toddlers, etc., in relationships as well next to the human beings.
Exactly. So some further points to keep in mind. If we do start to talk about resources, there are three important resources we have to consider. First of all, power. If we define power, I'm a political scientist by training, if we define power as the ability to accomplish an end, care is always about power. Now, usually our model is a caregiver who's got some capacity that a care receiver doesn't have. So a child can't really take care of themselves in the house because they don't know enough about things like the danger of the fire on the stove. But every care relation is about power, not only or always that the caregiver is more powerful than the care receiver. Power is always involved, and it's part of the reason why we are concerned to make sure that care relations are good, because that power can, of course, always be abused. Secondly, in the world we live in, care is almost always about gender. While men do care, and care increasingly, they don't talk about what they do as care. And historically, care has been deeply gendered, deeply raced, deeply organized by class and caste, so that people who are in lower status in society are the ones who do most of the dirty work, care work. And finally, because care is about building relationships, it is always about time, and it always has to exist over time, which is an important thing to notice and remember about it. There's some clear dangers always of care. And bad care often takes two forms. Care is always in danger of paternalism. That is, that caregivers substitute their knowledge and judgment for the needs of the people they're caring for. And second, that care is always in danger of parochialism. That is, that care receivers and givers restrict care only to those who are close to them and never think about the broader effects of the care they're doing. So far, I've introduced you to care ethics as a way to think. If you'll let me put it this way, it starts from the bottom up with a practical activity and reflects upon the moral and political life from that starting point. So there's a very short 15-minute introduction to what it is that care ethics does. Care ethics is obviously different already from what I've said. I hope you realize it's different, but let's make it more systematic by looking at a definition or an account of the basic difference that Daniel Engster in his book, The Heart of Justice, wrote. And this book was published in 2007. Liberal theories, he writes, which represent the most influential accounts of justice, assume the equality and autonomy of individual human beings. In their classical forms, these theories begin by imagining a number of equal and autonomous individuals coming together to form a political society, usually through a hypothetical social contract. Dan writes, care theory, by contrast, begins with individuals already existing in society and dependent upon one another for their survival, development, and social functioning, and highlights the unchosen obligations we all have towards others by virtue of our interdependency. Because we are all born in a state of dependency and depend upon others more or less throughout our lives, all capable individuals have obligations to care for others in need, regardless of our explicit or tacit consent. So you can already see the differences here between a theory that starts from rational individuals who make judgments about what's in my best interest, compared to being a dependent person always throughout your life, who needs others to accomplish what you want to accomplish, which means that others are caring for you, which means that you should recognize that you care for others. Now, this is very different from rights talk. And as I started to think about this lecture, I went back to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to find Leif Wainar's definition. That's how he pronounces his name. Definition, it should be Weinar, but he says Wainar. His definition of rights. He says, rights are entitlements to perform or not to perform certain actions, or to be in certain states, or entitlements that others perform certain actions or not in certain states. Rights dominate modern understandings of what actions are permissible and which institutions are just. Rights structure the form of governments, the content of laws, and the shape of morality as many now see it. To accept a set of rights is to approve a distribution of freedom and authority, and so to endorse a certain view of what may, must, and must not be done. Now, the question I have as I look at this definition is to ask, who are the people in this definition? Who's doing this? And the people who are doing this are obviously the kinds of people that Dan Engster just described. That is, they are rational, they are autonomous, they already have their capacities in the world to act well and with, their motives and actions in the world. And then they make judgments about accepting a set of rights, which is to approve a distribution of freedom and authority. So notice first who's doing this, and second, notice what they're doing. All they're doing is recognizing, if you will, that rights have power in the world, and they gain that power because we agree to them. But the people themselves aren't doing anything. They're just recognizing these rights as existing. And it's kind of interesting to me always, and what's different about care ethics is to start from the premise, who's doing what, with whom, to what end. And that's a different starting point than we will sit back, look at this set of rights, and agree that that's the way that freedom and authority should be organized in our culture. It's a very clear difference. People often say that there's a care justice debate, but in truth, no feminists really thought that care replaced justice. Demet Bubek, writing back in 1995 on care, justice, and gender, said, when the needs of two people are mutually exclusive, how do we resolve this as carers, is obviously a question of justice. And Angster noted, Bubeck notes that both Noddings and Gilligan implicitly are using just moral judgments as carers that could be formulated into a theory of justice.
The first thing which pops in my mind on this rights talk is that in youth care in the Netherlands, the main complaint of all youths and parents is nobody listens to us.
And that's exactly the problem, because we're going to get to that. I'm going to take a long way around to get to that, but it's exactly the problem, because this sets out what the rights are, and then somebody comes in and makes a judgment about, okay, how to apply these rights in this case. And they don't talk to the people. They don't know what's actually happening. They don't know what's actually going on. So as Wehner says, we might think of rights as correcting imbalances. But while states are tasked with protecting rights, they are often also the main abusers of rights. And this is one of the problems that's kind of a paradox of talking about human rights. So how do we make more rights more effective? In what way do rights inform or shape practice? Here, I actually think care is what provides us with some possibilities. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more explicitly about children's rights and care ethics, and ask the question, how might a care ethics perspective help us to realize the goal of the movement for children's rights?
May I ask one question about last slide?
Sure.
In a few slides ago, you talked about more or less a moral obligation to care.
Yes.
And obligation seems to oppose rights. So how do you combine those two?
Thank you. Actually, the language of obligation is Dan's. I don't usually use that language because I prefer the language of responsibilities. I prefer the language.
Yeah.
I prefer the language of responsibilities because it's more fluid, because it does suggest both. And of course, the thing about rights is they always create obligations. If I have a right to my own property, then you have an obligation not to come and use my property, right? Exactly. So in a way, rights are always mirrored by obligations. But in care ethics, we talk much more fluidly about the responsibilities that people are always changing and reflecting upon. And that's, in a sense, what really makes the moral heart of what care ethics is looking at, is how these responsibilities are shifting and how they're best explained and assigned. So here we go. Children's rights. So how might a care ethics perspective help us to realize the goal of the movement for children's rights? The Convention on the Rights of the Child identified 4 principles, and I take these from UNICEF. First, non-discrimination. Second, operate in the best interests of the child. Third, children have a right to survival and development. And fourth, the views of the child. These sound wonderful, don't they, in this abstract frame? But in fact, once you begin to try to apply them, we realize they're much more complicated than it looks here. And what I'd like to do now is give you some examples. As I was looking through the literature about care ethics and children, I picked out some examples of cases where they were hard cases, where people were trying to engage and think about really these principles, and let's look at them. So a care ethics alternative would suggest that rights and policies need to be made contextual, that there are 5 phases that we've already mentioned. There's a focus on relationships before resources. There's a focus on power, gender, and time. We have to ask the question, whose views count and how to weigh competing views? And we have to recognize that since children themselves care, how does that mean and matter? So this seems to me to set a different framework by which we'd address the kinds of problems we face. So some examples now with the 4 principles. The first example I want to talk about is an example of non-discrimination. And if you were actually thinking from the standpoint of the UN framework of rights, this probably wouldn't occur to you as a problem. But my colleague Vivian Bazalek, who is PhD, University of Utrecht, who is a scholar of care in South Africa, did a survey of her students there and learned something really important. Now these are speaking to the students who are in university, thinking about their lives in the past. And what they discovered is that because of the traditional culture, food was distributed in the family in a particular way. And the way it was distributed was that students reported a patriarchal and gerontocratic situation where men were given the best and biggest portions, and women and children were given the least adequate portions. And it was also distributed by age. So older people got more and better food. And when they were done eating, then the food was given to the women and then the children. So the children ended up with the worst food, where you might say, well, the children should get the best food. If we were thinking in terms of needs, we might recognize that people's needs for food maybe change as they age. And really, making sure that children get nutritious food is probably the most important thing in their development. Now, of course, if you as a child didn't get the most nutritious food, and you may well think that now that you're an adult, you're under a rights framework entitled to it, because after all, that's the way the society's set up. But it raises this really interesting question of how would you break down this form of discrimination from a traditional rights perspective? I'm not sure. But from a care perspective, you would certainly want to ask the question, whose needs should we meet first? And it might then produce a very different result than the way that food is distributed now in the household. So that's just an example of how we might think differently using care ethics. Here's another example, and this one might be closer to the kinds of situations that you are facing. If we're thinking about the best interests of the child, how do we know what those best interests are? How do we resolve, for example, a complaint? This is a report from Katrine de Grave's essay where she reports on a piece that Vivian Barnes wrote about, where a 16-year-old girl was in foster care, and she filed a complaint against her foster care family, and then she was moved out of that household into a hostel. Now, that's not what she wanted. She wanted them to stop doing the thing that she was complaining about. But what the state did was to think, oh my God, if she's making a complaint, she must be unsafe. What will happen to us if something happens to her? We'd best get her out of that situation, and moved her into a different setting, which was not family-like, and which was really much worse for her. But the rights consideration took precedence, she writes, over the care arrangements. She writes, the basic ontological position of relationality implies seeing children and young people in necessary relation to others, that is, in their family, their environment, their carers, and their professional workers, rather than in isolation. So if you isolate only, she has a complaint, it's a well-taken complaint, let's get her out of there, that's not the solution. The solution is to figure out how to make the complaint resolve within the situation, not to change the situation. But the way the workers are under pressure to resolve these cases quickly and cleanly, it's much easier to just move the kid around. Well, for them, it's not easier for the kid. And from that perspective, it's a problem. So best interests of the child, how do you do that? Here's a third example, the right to survive and develop. This is a statement from Amy Mullen, who is a philosopher who actually writes a lot about children's rights. She was the first person who explained to me long ago that children care. And sometimes they're wildly off in their understanding of what it means to care, but they do care. Here's an example that she would give is, a kid is having trouble at school, but knows that his or her parents are also going through stuff. They're having a hard time at work or whatever. So the child doesn't bother to mention to the parents that I got in a fight at school yesterday. And then when the kid comes home next week suspended for fighting again, the parents have no idea what's been going on, because to the child, she was taking care of her parents by not telling them that something bad was happening at school. Now, that's kind of a nice example to show that children do care, but their caring is not always on track. And sometimes we have to be that. So that's why we have to be really attentive to what it means to say children are caring in order to make judgments. So the question of survival and development really forces us to ask, who should define what survive and development mean? Now, for Amy Mullen, one of the most important things is obviously these things, right? To sustain children's ability to hope, we must protect them from abuse and neglect and recognize that emotional abuse and neglect can affect children's ability to hope as much as their physical counterparts. Exposure to violence is another threat to developing and sustaining hope, as are environments with no stability. Social support for families is key for children's hope, autonomy, and resilience. Children's resilience is positively correlated with their families receiving social support that includes the child or children, but is not limited to them and supports the family as a whole. Education, she goes on, is particularly important to sustaining and enabling hope because of its potential to increase opportunity and because teachers have considerable access to children. Now here she's already made a judgment, right? That what children need the most, or one of the things that children need a lot of, is hope. Even if they find themselves in a bad situation, everybody needs to be able to hope for a better future. Children no less than adults. And then the question she asks is, under that circumstance, a caring response would consider not just the children's rights, but what will give the child the opportunity to hope the most. It's a very different perspective on what it means to survive and develop, to think in terms of hope. And it sometimes would work, I think it would sometimes work even against families. For example, suppose you had a very closed community, which didn't allow the children to learn to read the main language of the culture. I'm not making this up. This is an example I'm thinking of concretely in New York State, where Hasidim don't teach English in the schools that they organize. And it means that kids who grow up in that community can't leave the community. So if you will, their realm of hope is constrained by the way they've been educated. Does that violate a right? Well, it might violate a right, but it makes more sense to think of it in terms of how those children's hopes have been shaped and what it means as a society for us to shape hopes for children one way rather than another. Once again, that way of thinking about it opens up lots of possibilities for us to think differently about what hope might mean. So there's a right to survive. The right to survival and development is very complex, but if we only think of it as a right, we're going to miss some of the nuance of trying to understand what that right might mean. And for Amy Mullen, the most important thing to think about here might be hope. We come last to the point we've already discussed, Per, I think you mentioned it, and that is the views of the child. Okay, so the United Nations states as one of the 4 principles of children's rights, the views of the child have to be included. But the views of the child have to be included is a very neutral way of making the point. It says, at an age in the UN language, it even says, at the age appropriate contribution, the views of the child should be included. It's passive. It doesn't say the child should have the right to speak. It says, make sure somebody's paid attention to listening to the kid. And that's not the same as really listening to the child. I picked an example of a case where listening to the child is really, really at the center of the practice, which is in a Maori practice called Kia Tika Kia Pono. This is ensuring the participatory rights of tamariki and rangatahi who are care experienced. The tamariki and rangatahi are children and young adults who have actually been in the care system. That's what care experience means here. And they asked those children to set the agenda, the research agenda, for the research they were doing about what it's like to live in care and how care can be better. And you might want to read this article because it's so moving. I couldn't put it all on one slide. But what really is important is that the children said things like, when I speak to you of my experience, I'm giving you a piece of myself. And you have to treat that with the appropriate respect, and degree of seriousness with which I've told you these things, which again is a very different approach from, well, we have a checklist here and we have to ask the child this experience. And when the child responds, then we'll do this. Anchored in and responsive to cultural context in New Zealand, there's a distinctive way of centering the children as not only this, I love this language, the expert leaders of their own lives, but also as knowledge holders, knowledge creators, and makers of meaning. They say the children should have consultation with children and young people from the earliest ages. Allow our insights into the architectural phase. We can be more than builders. It needs to be clear that the work being undertaken is going to be done together and through a two-way relationship. It's so difficult to do in an age when we have legal institutions which have a framework and which have a set of rules that they're bound to practice in order to be, among other things, in order to be viewed correct by the people who say that's what rights mean. Remember, rights are about accepting a set of institutions and ways of thinking about freedom and authority. But what the Maori children are saying is, no, we have to actually be included from the beginning and rethink this from the ground up.
In complex cases, now and then in the Netherlands, moral deliberation is used.
Yes.
And I have been present with some of them. And in all cases, parents and children were excluded. Can you have a moral deliberation without children and their parents?
I would think you need to include the children and their parents, and for that matter, others as well. The teachers, the others in the community, the ones who are engaged in this meaning making. You know, back here when Amy Mullen is talking about this, includes the child or children, but is not limited to them, includes the family, and includes the school, and includes all the people who are part of the child's life. The problem with moral deliberation in cases is that we've already decided this is a case. And in a way, we're already in trouble, right? Because something happened to set up the situation that created the bad outcome of this case. And what care ethics would ask us to do is to take a few steps back and ask, how did we get to this situation in the first place? And is there something in that set of circumstances which would allow us to change the way we're making judgments here? Yeah, I think that's the way to think about what happens in moral deliberation. So obviously, when rights are in conflict, that's what we try to figure out to do. And the views of the child versus the best interest is one of the conflicts we run into all the time, right? I mean, these are two of the basic rights, the best interest of the child and the views of the child. And it may be the case that these are themselves always rights that are in conflict. And the way to resolve rights in conflict is not by trying to measure them up or go back to your armchair and sit down and think about them, but to think more systematically about the situation. So here's a writing about too vulnerable to, here's this kind of, in a sense, Pierre speaks directly to your last question. The title of the article is Too Vulnerable to Participate. And it asks the question of whether or not you should include the vulnerable children. And the authors begin by saying, academic discourses in childhood studies have highlighted two apparently opposing points of view. One positioning children as primarily vulnerable with an emphasis on the need to safeguard and protect, and a second that places the focus on children's agency and competence with an emphasis on their right to participation. So it really is this question of whether or not you're going to think of the children as primarily vulnerable or primarily as capable of, on some level, participating in their own decision-making and in their own lives. Now, I would clearly end up thinking that you can't be too vulnerable to participate. There may be additional vulnerabilities in your participation that have to be attended to, right? You don't want to hurt children or put children in a situation where they're exposed to an abuser, where they feel unsafe. But there are all kinds of ways to resolve those conflicts, and those are better than making a judgment at the outset that there just shouldn't be included. So if we listen to children, what do we discover about their ways of thinking about the world? Interestingly enough, I've come across a recent article that was published in Children and Society by a couple of authors who are working in Chile, well, a bunch of authors who are working in Chile, who have been doing a 7-year longitudinal study asking children to think about their relations with their parents. And it's, again, an article worth reading, because what's interesting is that the children attach importance to parent-child relations of mutual care, the continuous attention paid to the other's material needs and emotional states, and the children's ethical and relational awareness in coping with events that occur in the privacy of the home. The studies have also shown how the children incorporate notions of right and justice in valuing this privacy. And the article goes on to say, and it also points out how the children recognize the strains of society in making judgments for what their parents are doing. So in one case, the children say things like, when I was younger, I made a lot of demands on my mother, but I realized my mother goes to work and people at work are treating her badly. And when she comes home, I should help her out rather than treat her badly too. And that is not unusual. I mean, children do have the capacity to make these kinds of moral judgments. And in making these kinds of moral judgments, are able to make a real contribution to the way we think about how they should be living their lives. They are, as the Maori said, not just the knowledge holders, but the knowledge creators in figuring out what would be the right thing to do. So in conclusion, I would say that care ethics offers an opportunity to study childhood a little differently, in which the model of humans as carers, both as caregivers and care receivers, requires concrete and deep engagement. And through that engagement, we can make different kinds of judgments. And this is the key. It's a way to both make good and bad outcomes. Both good and bad outcomes come, but it's a way to make better judgments about those outcomes. My dear colleague Selma Severhausen, who passed away earlier this year, wrote a book and was published in Dutch in 1996. The Dutch title was Oordelen met zorg, judging with care. The English title wasn't anywhere nearly as good, because I think in that language, judging with care, Selma captures what we want the ethic of care to do, which is to make judgments carefully that actually consider the situation in a realistic way. Ultimately, every care practice is aimed at the same thing, the goal of human flourishing. And the more we constantly come back to that goal, the more likely we are to be able to care well.
Thank you very, very much.
So that's what I have to say for today.
Yeah.
There's my email address. If anyone wants to email me, they're welcome to do so.